Greetings and welcome to our flagship edition of Classrooms Without Walls, a community empowering space where we discuss things that have not or are not being taught by traditional American institutions. I'm your host, Salim Barlow, and if you like this video, give it a like and subscribe at the end of this video. We want to start off with a topic that seems to have people divided, particularly in America, and that topic is slavery. But you cannot talk America without talking slavery, because slavery is as American as apple pie. And slavery has affected the American people, those who endured slavery and those who put slavery on other people. And it's caused a racial divide, it's caused class divisions, it's caused economic hardships, it's caused political chicanery over the years. Now, mind you, slavery is not just an American institution, even though America is deeply engrossed in it, even to this day, and I will explain why in a minute. But slavery started off as chattel slavery, meaning kids for cash, the original kids for cash. It started off in 1430 when Henry the Navigator decided that instead of trying to get to Africa through the east, he would go west and go down the coast of Africa and begin to set up settlements and raid the African communities of his people and began to ship them overseas for economic purposes. Traditionally, we've heard that slavery began in the 1600s. That means somebody has hidden or taken away 200 years of enslavement. And I'd also taken 200 years away, but they also take away an aspect of slavery. Slavery didn't just pop out of thin air. Slavery was a continuation of wars, religious wars, because now, mind you, when people propagate or indulge in religious wars, they are trying to control the narrative of the creation story. The Adam, not Steve, but the Adam and Eve story. And there's been Christians, Muslims, Jews, you name it. They've all fought wars to control this narrative. And the Christians fought what they called a series of crusades. I think it was 20 something crusades, even a children's crusade. And in order to control this religious narrative, because once you control the religious narrative, you put yourself or place yourself in between the creator of everything, the creator of the universe, and the rest of the people. You put yourself as, in other words, in order to get to the creator, you have to come through me. That's the arrogance of the people who have indulged in these wars. So the Christians, they lost, they only won one of these crusades, and they held Jerusalem at the time for a year or 2 years. But that, because they could not get to Jerusalem or hold Jerusalem to redefine the narrative, again, they went on the west side of Africa after defeating the Moors, who were Muslims, who were also Africans. And in 1430, they began bringing these brothers and sisters by the shiploads on the blessing of the Pope of the time. The Pope and Henry the Navigator got together and said, well, we have a way to make money. without doing anything. Because slavery, in its essence, is the control, ownership, and control of the means of production. Now, that might sound familiar to a lot of people because capitalism is also the ownership and control of the means of production. So you can't have one without the other. Something for, in other words, it's something for nothing. I work while you sit on your behind and do nothing. I become impoverished. I become ostracized. I become somebody that's despised or looked down the nose at, and you become filthy rich. And nobody ever knows the difference because you create classes with your wealth. You create classes of people and have them thinking that they're on top of the world. And they're nothing but ants marching to your tune of slavery in a greater sense. So it's important also to know slavery because they don't teach it in school. When you look at the Jewish people as a great example, by the time their children are 12 and 13, they are having bar and bat mitzvahs, which welcomes them into the adult community and welcomes them to have an opinion and a responsibility in world events. But when you look at Black folks, as a, we're not going, I don't want to get into Blacks versus African Americans. I'm just saying, when I say Black folks, you know what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about Africans. I'm not talking about Jamaicans. I'm talking about those displaced Africans who were kidnapped and brought over here, and they have bones in the soil. And that's I'll explain that later. Maybe not in this segment. But our children need to know who they are. They need to know where they come from. They need to know their history. If the Jewish children by the age of 12 knows their history, there's not one of them that does not know about the Holocaust. There's not one of them that doesn't know about the history of the Jewish people. How come our people do not know our own history? Because it's not taught in the home, because it's not taught on the street corners, it's not taught in the religious houses, it's not taught in public schools, it's not even taught in private schools. So we are basically an invisible people. Invisible because others refuse to see us. That being so, then we have to make sure that we see ourselves first, and then others pay attention to who we are and respect who we are. So, slavery as an American institution, of course, it began in the 1600s, not slavery total, but slavery as an American institution. When they had the transatlantic slave trade and they began to ship people over here in exchange for sugar and cotton, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but we were brought up under animals. We were considered animals, not humans. At no time during the course of chattel slavery did they ever take it upon, I'm talking about the slave master class. At no time did they take it upon themselves to define us as human beings. Um, even when they wrote the Constitution, they said, especially after a man named Dred Scott filed a suit for his freedom, because according to the law of the times, if you were taken to a free state and dwelt in that state for X number of months, you became a free person. Well, he was there for more than 60 days. He was there for about 6 months, and they did not automatically grant his freedom. So he filed suit in the courts. Well, after years of fighting in the local courts, the district courts, and taking his case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, the chief judge rendered an opinion, and he said, when the Constitution was written, all men created equal did not apply to this class of people whose ancestors were in chains. It did not apply to them. So you, Mr. Scott, have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And that has never changed. They never went back inside and said, well, we're going to change that to all human beings created equal. We're going to change that to, include all blacks. Because without that, it gave a mindset to not only presidents, but to the common folk that these people are nothing but property to do as we will, to sell as we will, to accuse as we will, to murder as we will. Because there was, during slavery, there were no black people in prison because the slightest crime, being it stealing a chicken, could be a death sentence, or being it talking back to the master could be a death sentence. But because all of this has not been reversed, it's not even talked about. If you mention it now, the average senator, congressperson, even the average person on the street, they don't want to talk about it. But without talking about it, things haven't changed. In other words, Dred, there was a man who, he's an attorney. His name is Brian Stevenson. Now, Brian Stevenson, for a short bio on him, he's from the Delaware, Baltimore area. And his grandfather was from Philadelphia. When he was a young man or a young boy, his grandfather was murdered by two juveniles in Philadelphia. And Brian Stevenson, after discovering this and finding this out, he didn't become angry. He didn't become despondent. What he did was excel in school, graduated from high school. He went to college. And after getting his degree in law school, he went to the South to represent um, indigent people on death row. After that, Brian Stevenson um, expanded his practice to include other people not on death row. One such person was a young white boy who was about 12 when he and someone else uh, were alleged to have murdered a policeman. They found them guilty and sentenced them to life imprisonment. So Brian Stevenson got with, uh, I believe it was professors at Temple University, and who had the professors had done a study concerning brain maturation. And according to their study, the brain does not mature to, at the very least, 26 years of age. Some parts of the study say 31, but 26 or 31, either one. So they went all the way to the Supreme Court with this argument. And the argument is that a person, a teenage person, is too young to have made a rational decision because his brain is still in the process of maturing. Therefore, he has an opportunity, if given it, to change. There's still room for him to change when his brain finally matures. Well, the Supreme Court arbitrarily put that figure at 17. Now, um, they have their reasons why they did that. I differ with them because when we're talking about teenagers, we're talking about all the way up to 17, 18, and 19, not 17. And then legally, when the child goes to college, they're still under their parents' rule as a teenager or as an not yet mature adult. But anyway, they limited it to 17. So they overturned the conviction of this young white kid. And as a result, um, This was in 2012. The people across the country were saying, okay, well, what about all these other people that were 17 and under, since you limited it to 17? Well, Pennsylvania initially, they fought against it. They did not prepare for anybody 17 and under who was serving a life sentence, and known also in the business as um, death by incarceration, not by electrocution, but by incarceration. Because they dismantled the electric chair, but they put in place death by incarceration. But across the country, and particularly in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania has the highest incarceration rate of any nation, state, county, or city in the world. Pennsylvania has had the highest number of um, juvenile lifers or juvenile people sentenced to death by incarceration than any other place in the world, even third world countries, even the countries that we like, China and Russia. They don't have this high incidence of juveniles being sentenced to death by incarceration. But all of this is an outgrowth of slavery because they never um, address the issue of slavery. So to make a long story short, the 17 and under crowd, they all were resentenced. Now, all of them didn't get out because all of them didn't have um, X number of years in. And they set the standard more or less at 25 to life. And so a lot of them who had more than 20, or most of them who had more than 25 years in, 5 years later, after another court case was filed to make that case of the little white boy retroactive, then the juvenile lifers began to get out of prison wholesale. I think it was about 300 or 400 of them. But Brian Stevenson, in his talks beyond just the courtroom, Brian Stevenson made a statement. He said, I do not believe that slavery ended in 1865. I concur. And here's why. Prior to 1865, we were undergoing chattel slavery, which is an agrarian society. We were being used agriculturally to make somebody else money for nothing. They sat back and give out the orders while we work and got nothing but hardship and headaches. And in 1865, which a lot of people would like to point to, President Lincoln passed what everybody calls the Emancipation Proclamation. Oh, they have a big statue of him in DC, which I haven't seen except in pictures. They call him the Great Emancipator. But for those who uh, have not been taught, whether it be on the street corner, whether it be in the religious institutions, or whether it be in the public school system, what they haven't taught you is that emancipare, which is the root of emancipation, means to change ownership. Doesn't mean to free anything. It means to change ownership. In fact, when he um, made that proclamation, he wanted to change ownership from the South owning these people to the North owning these people, which would put the Southern slaves in rebellion against the Southern people who were waging war, the insurrectionists who were waging war against America. But after that, slavery continued, meaning something for nothing, meaning looking at people as, what would you say, looking at people as chattel, or I got 2 horses, I got 5 cows, I got 15 chickens, and I got 2 slaves. They're all my property. and I'll do so with them as I choose or will. But slavery, when they stripped the Southerners of their chattel slavery position, they passed that on to corporate America. Corporate America now runs this system called slavery. And even the people who sit in the suburbs in $1 million homes, they think they got it made. But if you're not making, or you cannot make the stock market go up or down 10 or 15 points today, not tomorrow when on the opening bell, today, on a Sunday, you're not white. You're a slave. You're just like anybody else. You have not, you are sitting in the middle. There's a 6% or 5 or 6% of people who do not work. They just call shots. They have billions, trillions. Why would 5% of the people on the planet need billions and trillions? Why everybody else starve? Why? But because they give you more than they give me, or because they give you more than they give somebody else, they make you believe that you've got it made. Because you'll look down your nose at me and say, at least I got it better than him. Okay, so you're on the plantation, I'm out in the field, you're in the house. But the rules of where you can go, what you can do, what your inheritance is, all of that still applies to you. But back to situation that slavery began as religious wars. Slavery became an economic means. Slavery in its ideology still exists today. Just because you allow somebody to physically go from South Carolina to South Philadelphia, that hasn't changed anything. Just because you allow uh, 2% of blacks to be basketball and football players and make millions of dollars, that means nothing when you're taking the rest of us and regentrifying us out of existence. When you're taking the rest of us and not even paying us minimum wage. So what do we care about a 6%? In fact, they're sellouts because all of us, not just them, couldn't get on the front of the bus. All of us could not swim in certain pools and during certain areas. All of us were set upon with dogs and water hoses and fire hoses, on and on and on. So now we come to this day, and you think you're different than I am? You think instead of taking your millions and trying to better and further the race like the Jews would do, like a lot of Caucasians do, like uh, the Spanish do, the Mexicans, uh, like all these ethnic groups, like they do. They open Mexican banks, they open Vietnamese banks, they open Middle Eastern banks, and we're sitting here buying luxury automobiles, and we're sitting here buying designer clothes that we can't afford, and it's making us look like who? What? What's the difference between the monkey on the organ grinder in a suit and a guy parading in his community of impoverished people in a three-piece suit that costs $5,000 or $6,000? What's the difference? The slave master used to take his hardest working Negro and give him his secondhand clothing and dress him up and make him the coachman so that he can parade him around. And he began to really feel that he wasn't in slavery, that he was better than all the other slaves, even though he could not marry, even though he had no say in his children's welfare, his children's upbringing, his children's education, his children's future. And to this day, most black men still don't understand that they should be their children's educator, their children's upbringer, their children's protector, they're protecting their children's future. Because protecting the future of your child is protecting your own future, even long after you're gone, because that's a legacy that carries on. But since they did not detoxify us, or they did not detoxify the American public from the institution of slavery, that institution still exists. And it affects all of the institutions, because every institution in America is intertwined. You can't have one without the other. If you're talking politics, you're talking economics. If you're talking economics, you're talking education. If you're talking education, you're talking religion. If you're talking religion, you're talking about family institutions and family values. So you can't have one without the other. And if you're not willing to talk about it, nothing has really changed, which is why there is so much dissension today, which is why we see this violence happening. Um, Show me a household where the child at 12 is able to make a decision and take bar mitzvah. Do you see violence amongst the Jewish people? Because their children are maturing. You don't see Jewish people 12 and 13 years old spending 65% of their time bouncing basketball or throwing footballs. Who cares about that? The mule was stronger than us. The horses were stronger than us, but that didn't save us from slavery. So I don't care how much weights we lift. I don't care how fast we can run. If we get paid millions and we take that millions um, and buy fancy cars and move in white neighborhoods and marry outside of our race, we're nothing but window dressers for American oppression. That's all we are. So I want to continue with this thing called slavery. Slavery strips a person of all humanity from the education. You know, it was back in the day they used to say, well, the African has contributed nothing to history. That's because in slavery, there's no two ways. You're either all slavery, pro-slavery, or you're anti-slavery. Of course, every slave should have been, but wasn't always the anti-slave. But which means when you strip a person of his or her humanity, you first take away their connection to their creator. Instead of them practicing their religion, which, by the way, they took most of the slaves from West Africa. West Africa was an Islamic enclave. So when you take people out of that environment because you can't convert them to Christianity, you're waging wars to convert the world to Christianity. But when you take them, there's first going to be wars because people will say, no, this is my religion. Who are you to define my religion? So there's going to be wars, first of all. Once you've killed off, when you got guns and I have spears, well, the spear chuckers lifestyle is short-lived. Um, so once you killed off all the warrior class, or those who felt as though they were warriors chucking their spears, um, now you begin to kidnap them. So you went from murder to kidnap. You kidnap people, you put them on ships, you brought them to a stop-off point in Europe. And then from Europe, you sent them across the sea and you demanded that they don't remember because you killed off their fathers. So after a while, everybody is babies. Everybody is first generation this. When those 4, 5, or 6 generations or hundreds of years before you, you don't remember. It's the same thing that's happening here in America. Uh, most people, if you ask them who Marva Collins is, they don't know. They can't tell you that. If you ask the average person who Marva Collins is, and that's only, uh, 50 years ago, they can't tell you because that type of information, the history of the African American people, is not being taught. Not in the home, not in the public school system. And if you don't know where you've come from, you don't even know who you are. And you have no idea where you should be going because you are no longer connected to a legacy. And that means the taking away your humanity is still a fact here in 2024 when you think you have everything. And one note that I want to make about African Americans, I know we call ourselves by many things, but we are displaced Africans who were kidnapped and sold into America. But the American portion of it is important because, and we'll deal with this under the label of reparations. Those who are pushing for reparations, they're pushing for the people who have bones in the soil, Americans, not those who, just because you come from Africa 2 years ago, you're going to call yourself black and reap rewards. It don't work that way. You have to have bones. You're from Africa, but you have American bones in the soil. So, but also remember, when somebody takes you away from your religion and you have no knowledge of it, and then they begin to teach you their religion, they begin to demand that you uh, not only not fact they didn't have a religion. A man who will murder you in the morning and try to teach your child in the evening, who's he? He's still a murderer. I don't care that just because the sun set or the sun ain't shining, he's still a murderer. And you have a murderer trying to teach your child religion. Um, but he's taken away your ability to see the divine in you, the divine outside of you. He's taken away that ability. Taking away that ability of seeing the divine, that means he has the last say. He meaning the slave master class. He has the last say on whether you live or die. Now we know nobody gets out of this life alive. Nobody. And nobody can predict what day they're going to leave. So there must be a force far beyond the nonsense that they've taught for the past 6,000 years about them being in charge. But how they convince a lot of people that they are in charge is through images. And these images meaning uh, God, when we make movies, is a guy floating in the sky, laying on a bed of clouds with a white beard, a white face, white robes on, like Mr. Clean, only he's got hair, Mr. Clean with hair. Um, so they had us all believing, and to this day, there's still many of us who believe that you can't get beyond this life or you can't be successful in this life unless you accept his visuals or his interpretation of divine. Meaning, oh, we got to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Well, if you had depicted Jesus Christ, who's from Africa, as a black man with woolly hair or with dreadlocks, maybe you could have convinced me. Maybe that uh, fallacy would have stuck with me. And I'm saying me because other people are still stuck. And they may not see themselves as stuck. More power to them. Um, but there is no, when you go to prayer, you don't pray to another man. You don't pray to somebody to intervene for you. You pray, it's not like Verizon, Infinity, or AT&T. You have your own line. You got a direct line to your creator, just like anybody else. Well, first of all, you have to know that you're created. But if you've been taught that you're no more than a mule, if you've been taught that you're no more than somebody else's property, how would you know that until you're taught that? Which means um, not only from the divine level, every other level in society has been affected by the slave mentality, the slave culture. The slave was not allowed to read and write. It was forbidden. It was a death sentence to be caught reading as a slave or attempting to read, or anyone attempting to teach the slave to read or write. You can get a death sentence for that. Well, now that they taught us the basics of the English language, which goes from, left to right, as opposed to where we come from, the East, which all their languages go from right to left. So they start off on the right foot, not the left. They start off on the right. We don't know that. So we're busy teaching our children to think from left to right. In fact, we're not doing that. Someone else is teaching our children. We're not telling our children by the age of 12, you have to be responsible. You can sit with the elders and you can make a decision on the economics of the community. You can make a decision on the politics of the community. Nowadays, we're not making a decision on the politics of the community. Somebody else chooses an individual that we don't know. They may be educated in American education, which is to me is not the epitome of education. It's the epitome a lot of times of stupidity, depending on the individual and how it affects them. Because some individuals get arrogant and become arrogant because they have several degrees. Well, I'm sitting here in America just like you. Where did your degrees get you? Because if your degrees didn't first get you to that you have to master the concept of we amongst your own class and then amongst humanity, then those degrees are worthless. You could have put them on the roll and used them when you finished using the toilet. But also, no history is taught in the American school system. And if they teach anything, they try to limit it to Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Paul Robeson. Sometimes they exclude him, and then they go to a few actors, basketball players, football players, those people like that. They don't talk about people who've made a difference. They don't talk about how do you become a man in spite of the things that you've been through. How? Well, first of all, you have to know what you've been through. You have to know your history. Because take a man like Malcolm. He didn't know. Processing his hair, out there chasing the horse, out there uh, trafficking in dope, trafficking and perpetuating robberies. He didn't know who he was until he was brought to a halt and sat down and said, no, in jail, put him in prison. Now, he could have used prison as a means to become even more ingrained in a criminal mentality. But instead, he looked in the mirror and said, who am I? That's the first question. You have to ask those questions if you're serious disrobing from this slave mentality, your slave wardrobe. You have to disrobe and throw all that away and come into a new birth, which begins from who am I? And then it continues with why did I consider myself to be any type of human being that had intelligence, and my intelligence wound put me in the penitentiary? No, that's your ignorance that put you in the penitentiary. not your intelligence, because you haven't gained intelligence yet. You've just been given information, and information does not make you who you are. I don't care how much of it you accumulate. I don't care how glib you become in speech. I don't care how many, again, um, degrees you have. As I said before, and I'll say it many times, um, most of you, or most of the people with degrees, can just take them and put them on a roll and use them before they leave the bathroom and flush them. But anyway, so what Malcolm did, not only did he want to define who he was, Malcolm wanted to know what didn't I know that became roadblocks, that became stumbling blocks in my development as a human being. So he wanted to know, okay, what is the definition of things? So Malcolm got a dictionary and he wrote the dictionary out by hand from cover to cover. So that that doesn't mean he memorized the dictionary, but in most instances, any time he was involved in any conversation, whether it be casual or whether it be a debate, Malcolm knew something about what was being said because in his computer bank, which is his brain, he was able to go in where he had put enough in storage and talk about or debate subject matter, particular subject matter. Then Malcolm said, I need a religious connection. Well, in America, even though Muslims have existed for well over 1,400 years, even though Muslims existed in this country from the outset of slavery in America, the Muslims didn't have an outreach program to reach out to the enslaved people in America. Only when the enslaved people broke through and began to say they are Muslims, even though they had to make several adjustments, and they are still in the process of continuing to make these adjustments. They're growing, just like the brain surgery. The brain does not mature until the age of 26. So religion and education and politics, all these things does not mature until you get a little older. In fact, in most cultures, they say the age of 40 is the age of maturation, because at the age of 40, you should no longer be looking for what you want in life. You should know what you want in life. You should have been a father, so you know what it means to be a father. You should have been a husband, so you know what it means to be a husband. You should be a person responsible in the community. All of those things by the age of 40. So Malcolm reached out to um, Elijah Muhammad, or the black Muslims who existed in the penitentiary in the 40s back then, who were being arrested for following Elijah Muhammad. They were putting a lot of brothers who claimed that they were Muslims back in the 40s in the penitentiary. Well, they influenced people that were all working there or coming there. So Malcolm reached out to Elijah, and Elijah Muhammad, mind you, Elijah Muhammad was born in the 1800s, just to give a short bio on him. And he used to be a Baptist preacher. So when he said later on that the worst enemy of the so-called American Negro is the Baptist preacher, he knew what he was talking about. But he met a man uh, from the Middle East, a man who began to introduce him into a concept of Islam. A man who understood, as did Elijah in the coming years, that these people here, you're not talking about the average person. You're talking about slaves whose reality has been whitewashed by this white tornado Mr. Clean, cleaned everything like a splash or bottles or upon bottles of bleach to make a people into animals. So they had no um, academic concepts. They had no spiritual concepts beyond what they were forced to accept. They have no political standing because they were just being allowed in politics in the very late 60s, except for one or two out of millions. But in the late 60s, that's when you start seeing more and more people getting into politics. So this people had to be treated um, differently. Uh, in fact, these people, and you have to follow me, and we're going to discuss this in later episodes. And if you have questions about anything, we'll answer those questions. You can um, write your questions in the chat, or you can write the questions or tune in to the additional streams when we come on. Um, but Elijah Muhammad and the man that he met, they knew that it took a special um, teaching, so to speak. And of course, a lot of Muslims to today may disagree with this. That's their prerogative. But they know, and I'm being very abstract right now, so you have to pay close attention. During the time of the establishment of Islam back 1400 years ago, there were Africans, enslaved Africans, and they became slaves after they were freed. And listen to what I'm saying. They did not, there's no such thing as a slave and a freed man. You cannot be a freed slave or enslaved freed man. The two are incongruent. They don't go together. You have to be one or the other. So the most famous of these Africans was Bilal ibn Rahba. And Bilal, even when he acknowledged that he was Ahad with the one finger, I follow Muhammad. I want to be, a Muslim. I'm a Muslim. But he was still enslaved. So again, there's no such thing as a freed slave, a freedman slave, or enslaved freedman. So once Bilal was purchased out of slavery, because he showed by his actions and deeds that he was indeed sincere on becoming a Muslim to the nth degree, like all the other Muslims, Bilal's freedom was purchased. And after that, Bilal became the first muazzin, or the caller to prayer in Islam. And Bilal became the first accountant uh, in Islam. You feel me? But the period before these people are freed, not necessarily freed physically, but they had, when you're talking about chattel slavery, you have to be freed from concepts, which is why it's necessary in America to talk about it. If you don't talk about it, we're not getting anywhere. So the first concept was believing that the white man is God, because every single um, thing in your life force you to bow down to accept a white skin as your reality. And that's like a man standing on his head. You're looking at other people's feet and thinking you have to climb up their body to get up there to where they are, to become intelligent as they are. So rather than go straight to them and tell them this is what we're dealing with, because the slave mind wasn't able to conceptualize. A slave mind does not conceptualize. It's an animal. It functions on animal needs and animal wants. I want to eat. I want to have sex. I want fancy clothes. I want a big car. I want to just get high. I want to just tiptoe through the tulips on my heroin reality. Those are slave concepts. Those are boy concepts, if you will. So the first thing they had to do was change this dependence on a white God, on white Jesus, on white religion, period. Which means they had to set this man upright. And so when you hear from the Muslims or the so-called Muslims, I'll say so-called Muslims, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, you'll hear them say they're an upright man, a man who understands that he's human, a man who understands that that he must have a wife, um, and that begins the process of procreation with bringing children into the world. And he must be responsible for providing food, clothing, shelter, and protection for his family. Prior to that, we didn't know any of those things. We were not only physically coming out of slavery, we were just treated as another hog, another pig, or another cow, or another mule. But we were put into another form of slavery called sharecropping. So all year long, we worked and couldn't make any headway. So we were kept in a perpetual state of slavery. By the time sharecropping began to dwindle in the late 20s or 30s, um, and these wars were going on, we weren't even allowed to fight in the military. The segregation took over. You can't go in this restaurant. You can't go in this swimming pool. You can't go to the same school. You definitely ain't going to no colleges. I mean, you can't worship in the same religion. How are you going to get me to believe a white divinity and I can't attend a white church? How ridiculous does that sound? So Malcolm tuned into Elijah and this guy that he had met. And there's always a controversy about Elijah saying, God in person. Well, when you're talking to an animal, you're talking to, again, a person who can't exceptionalize. First, they don't even know that they're human because they've been told for imagine 400 or 500 years. If you're kept in a cave, your whole world is nothing but a cave. When you come out here and you see the rest of the world, who says that you're not going to get angry? Who says? But get angry about what? You don't know you wouldn't even know what you're getting angry about because you have no knowledge of your past. You're an empty vessel. So this empty vessel has to be filled up. You can't, if you just give him everything at once, he'll drown. So the first thing they said was, this man came in the person of God. Okay. The slave master told us God was the white man. So our concept of who God was, who had control over us, who determined whether we lived or died, um, who determined the color of the angels, who determined the color, who read all these flowery stories that we didn't understand from this book called the Bible. We didn't even know how to spell Bible at the time because we couldn't read or write. So Elijah just replaced the white man with a black man, a white God with a black God, so that people can step outside of themselves and say, hey, you've been lying to me all the time. You haven't been truthful to me. Now I'm beginning to see that there's something else. Of course, they had to grow from there on and on and on. But to be continued on that subject. But Malcolm joined the Muslims. And when Malcolm came out of prison, Elijah afforded him a platform to express himself. He said, here's a man who is self-educated. Here's a man who first he read just about anything he got his hands on. And then he began to read selectively. Primarily, again, he studied from the dictionary. And then he began to read a lot of Black history to understand historically where we come from and what we had been through. Um, So Elijah, when he came out, Elijah gave him that platform solely for the purpose of taking us from the 50s or the late 40s on. In other words, Malcolm was a fresh breath of fresh air because he was a man that wasn't just um, following orders, but he was a man that not only followed orders because he was disciplined, but a man whose brain could conceptualize because he was educated on definitions. So you couldn't just throw a word out there, or you couldn't throw a concept out there and Malcolm not question it. He was only going to agree with it if he knew it to be true. But if there was any doubt in there anywhere, he would question it, and he would go into his computer, uh, which is his brain, and he would take it through there and see the truth or the falsity of it. But that's what we need to do. We need to go back inside ourselves. We need to understand that power to change lies within. Um, when we conceive of a child or in the process of conception, we have to generate a billion um, cells. And those billion cells go forth. It seems they're on a journey. That journey may seem long, but that journey is probably 6 to 12 inches. And then once those cells reach a certain 6 to 12 inches, only a few of them get that far, a few thousand, a few hundred. And then out of that, only one gets an opportunity to procreate. But the beauty of that is that they all start out wanting to procreate, reaching for that innate desire to replicate themselves. And only one gets there. But that one represents the intent of all of them. So slavery not only still exists religiously, academically, because academically, we are not being taught any of our history. We're not being taught our history from Africa. We're not being taught history since being in America. We're not taught history as a legacy. You know, a person might look in the 40s and when they go to school, particularly American school, they're taught about World War II. That's it. That's the only thing that was going on in history. World War II. What does that have to do with it? And especially since we weren't permitted, uh, we were being segregated against, and we're saying, "Hey, we live in America. We have become a part of the American fabric, and we misconceived in our minds that we were more than just slaves. So we tried to demand that we become fighters for America, not knowing that those who were saying no were still stuck on the concept this is our property. How can our property address us, come before the court jester, coming before the court of the king and demands, with a list of demands? That's ludicrous. So we need to know our history. We need to know how the violence that we see going on in our streets today is connected with our lack of education. We need to know that the poverty that we exist in today is number one, a result of the lack of education, number one, and then the discriminatory practices that continue as a result of the lack of education of the American people who think that we've been free and that we should have as much as anybody else if we put our uh, if we put the work in. We put the work in for 600 years. Cut the nonsense. So if you like this content, and of course anything that you can possibly imagine that's not taught to us in the schools, on the street corner, in the religious places of worship, in the halls of politics, in the halls of so-called justice. Anything that you think that you would want us to speak about, or you would want to tune in as, tune in every week. And if it becomes popular enough, we'll tune in every day. We'll put the work in to make sure we speak to you every day. I'm your host, Brother Salim, and I'll speak to you on the next episode. And if you like this content, subscribe to this YouTube channel. Peace out.